and welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast. I'm Helen, and this week we are going to be talking about really big picture stuff when it comes to, redesigning civilization in some ways. You know, on this podcast we quite often dig into the details of very specific solutions and ideas, and this time we are going to be taking a really broad overview of the whole thing. So what you're about to hear is a discussion that I had with Bianca Nogrady, and she is an Australian environmental journalist. She's written lots of stuff, and she has just written a book which is a Wired guide, it's quite hard to say that, which is called Climate Change: How We Can Get to Carbon Zero, and it's very very bright green. And the book, it's a sort of primer actually. It's a really clear it's a sort of no-nonsense guide to lots of things, but what it's got in it is lots of examples of projects that are actually happening now. And so the things that we covered, there's a whole range of things, but glass production and the energy needed to train machine learning algorithms, so artificial speech recognition. I hadn't thought about the energy needed for that. We talked about what happens to the energy produced by computer servers and how it can be recycled, and I think that there were parsnips in there as well. So it was really cheering actually to hear so many examples of projects that are actually happening now. And of course we also had a very good rant about all the things that aren't happening yet. So here is the chat with Bianca.
My Energy is putting the I back into British innovation. My Energy is putting the I back into inventing the future. My Energy is putting the I back into inspiring a nation. Recharging the world with green, smart energy. Charge your EV with your PV and more. Visit myenergy.com and help to spark the green revolution. My Energy, driving the charge to a greener future.
Thank you for joining us, Bianca. It's a pleasure to have you with us on the Fully Charged podcast. So you write about lots of things, but in particular, recently you have written a very bright green book called Climate Change and How We Get to Carbon Zero. And it's great. It's this primer on how to do. You know, it's sort of we here on Fully Charged we dig into the details a lot, but we don't often just have the big picture. So it's great to have this. But just tell us. You introduced the book in your own words. What's it all about?
So this book started as because Wired UK is producing a series of these pocket guides on a whole range of different topics. And they came to me and said, what do we do on climate change? How do we fix our climate? And, you know, these books are about 25,000 words long. So how do you fix a climate in 25,000 words? Seemed a little big, perhaps. So anyway, after some kind of discussion, we narrowed it down to how do we decarbonise our world, basically, because that's essentially the main problem, and it's also a proxy for a whole range of other problems that we have. So that's really the idea of this book, is a kind of a one-stop guide, or hopefully one-stop guide to the main areas of decarbonisation. So, you know, we cover food, we cover transport, obviously the energy sector, but we've divided energy into energy generation and energy use, which is energy efficiency, which obviously is a very important part. Sorry, excuse me. And then looking also at waste, we have to cover negative emissions technology. So how do we actually reverse the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere? And then there's also a chapter on carbon markets, because those are obviously a fairly key mechanism to drive investment in the sort of negative emissions technologies and low carbon technologies that we need. So yeah, the idea is that you can kind of hopefully read this and get a sense of the big picture and how it all fits together, everything from reforestation to energy efficient light bulbs to recycling to low carbon agriculture, all of those things in one big. It is very concise and it's very clear, and I think that in a way that's it's a great achievement, because there is so much written about climate change, but actually you don't often get a really, almost like a textbook. It is almost like a sort of, I don't want to do it down by saying a school textbook, but it's that kind of clarity, isn't it? No, that's what it felt like. Yeah, that's what it felt like writing it. Yeah, I mean, it's possibly the most intensively researched thing I've ever done in my life, because writing about, for example, how do we decarbonise the construction sector and building materials? It's okay. So what are the options there? And then you start looking into low carbon steel manufacture or low carbon cement, or even like positive carbon cement. But then to write about those, I need to understand, well, how is cement currently manufactured and how is steel currently manufactured? So I mean, it just about broke my brain, because I had to understand what we do now so that I could then explain what we could be doing in the future. So it sort of is, I guess, a textbook in the sense that it is trying to cover everything that you need to know about this very big challenge that humanity is
you
facing.
found, I mean, one of the things about it is it's quite a positive book in the sense that it is, you do mention, there's a lot in it about who's doing stuff already. And like you just said, I mean, you describe all that research, but actually that would then get, 5 lines, but they're very clear 5 lines on exactly what you need to do about cement. But was it easy to find examples? Because one of the things about, solutions is you can always go, oh, well, I've found a person, somewhere on this massive planet, someone is doing one thing. The examples in here, would they represent like other lots of, I mean, here on Fully Charged, we hear about new technologies all the time, right? But for you sort of coming into this, like, I need to find some people who are doing some stuff. Were they easy to find, or was it, is anyone doing anything about cement?
Look, that was what was so incredibly encouraging about this, was they were easy to find. You look at just about any sort of area of our lives, our industries, anything where we're generating carbon dioxide, you will find somebody who is already doing or is on the cusp of implementing a solution to decarbonise that. Like it was not hard to find these. And that was, I think, for me, the most positive takeaway from doing this book, is that these solutions are here. Not only are they here, that they are scalable, they are efficient, they are economically sound. They make sense on every level to do this. And I know that makes me sound like a complete zealot, but they really, really are. We've had these solutions for a long, long time, and I firmly believe that the reason that these haven't been implemented is in large part because of the opposition that the fossil fuel industry has put up. And has, I guess, paid for it politically to stop these solutions being implemented. So there is, the solutions are some of them are so simple and so clever. And what was also really positive about it was that so many of these solutions have additional benefits that go far beyond simply reducing the amount of carbon dioxide emissions. So many of these solutions are, they're more sustainable in a whole range of ways. For example, low carbon agriculture, so much of what's happening there is putting carbon back into the soil, which is then addressing this massive issue that we've got in terms of soil fertility and declining soil fertility around the world. When you start decarbonising the energy sector, obviously get these enormous added benefits in terms of reduced pollution, reduced mining and environmental damage caused by mining. The benefits are so sort of huge that, in a way, the carbon, you think this is a proxy for everything just being.
It definitely feels like
better.
that. I'm very fed up of the argument as treating this whole thing as a hair shirt exercise. It's like, no, there are better ways to, like, if you look back at history, we would say that what we have now is better than what we had before. So why do we not see this as just the next version of better? It's rubbish.
Absolutely. It is so ridiculous. And, that notion of, like, just looking at the energy grid, for example, I mean, where I live, I'm in a fairly small town. It's 2 hours west of Sydney. Whenever we have a lightning storm, the power grid goes down. Whenever we have bushfires, which we obviously have had on a fairly regular basis, the power network goes down because we're dependent on these long transmission lines, wooden poles. When those go, the whole network goes down. If we had, these localized microgrids, decentralized power systems using solar energy, because we certainly have no shortage of sun, although perhaps not right at this exact moment, but we have plenty of wind. The local resources would offer so much more energy security and energy resilience for a town like this that it just makes sense. I did a lot of kind of, why aren't we doing this already? Hands in the air. And I still don't actually know. That's the one question I don't know. Why aren't we doing this already?
We'll get into some of the technologies you talked about, because since you wrote about them so concisely, I'm sure there's a lot more to say. But before, I did just want to pick up on that about, your accent gives you away as an Australian, and you are based in Australia. And Australia has not been known for its robust response to climate change, let's say. And then you've had a lot of
national
wildfires.
shame.
Just on that, like how is Australia doing now? And did the wildfires actually change opinion on this?
Yes, I think they did. They not only did they change opinion, I think, on climate change, but I think there's also a growing awareness that Australia's is struggling with the challenge of remaining livable in a climate changed future. It did become very, very apparent where most of Australia lives in a kind of narrow strip pretty much around the entire coastline, which is essentially squeezed, what will eventually be squeezed between rising sea levels and drought, and then also be scorched by bushfire. So
you're not selling it as a place to live, I have to say.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Look, believe me, I just already think I've said to quite a few people, the future's Northern Canada. I can't see
all the water, all the space.
Canada's going to go on at that.
It's not too hot.
I know, exactly. I think, Australia is one of those nations that will be very much on the front line of the climate emergency. I mean, obviously there are a host of others, but for a nation like Australia, which continues to export coal, to consume coal, which continues, for reasons that baffle me, to elect governments that are stacked with climate deniers and are very firmly in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. We're digging our own grave as a nation. If we're staring down the barrel of anything more than a 2 degree, I mean, even 1 degree, 1.5 degree change in temperatures is going to be catastrophic for Australia, not to mention so many of the low-lying Pacific nations, our nearest neighbours. I mean, it's a source of intense frustration, would be putting it quite mildly, at Australia's absolute, well, when I say Australia, it's the kind of current Conservative government and previous and successive Conservative governments, their failure to respond to climate change and to mitigate Australia's spectacularly high per capita emissions, once you factor in our coal exports, I hope will be the epitaph of their political careers. That will be what they go down in notoriety for. If there was ever a chance to see them prosecuted for crimes against humanity, environmental crimes against humanity, then I would be there with my proverbial knitting basket at the guillotine, so to speak. So it's
we've never descended to suggesting violence, but
very, very grim.
I suppose knitting at the guillotine is one way.
No, but
I
think
it's knitting with sustainable wool. It's very important.
I think knitting with sustainable wool. Oh, look, I think it's difficult when so many other Western nations and so many other nations, have accepted the science of climate change. I mean, Australia has been, we've got the very sorry distinction of being one of the only countries in the world to actually reverse a successful carbon trading scheme. We had a carbon trading scheme. It was implemented for 2 years. It resulted in a decrease in emissions, no decrease in economic growth, and yet it was reversed as soon as the Conservatives got back in power. So so
what's happening now then?
Certainly,
just because there's COVID means no one's travelled anywhere, which might be great for flight emissions, but it means we haven't sort of met any Australians to ask recently, really. And COVID has made everyone sort of turn inwards a little bit just out of necessity. So in the past year, what's been going on in Australia? When is there more public pressure when it comes to climate change? Has there been some good change, some great change while the rest of us weren't looking, I guess?
There's definitely public pressure, but to give you an example, two examples of how the political situation is not changing, is that the committee that was formed to drive Australia's post-COVID recovery was led by a former natural gas company executive, and Australia's recently appointed it was a climate change authority, and the man who was appointed to head that has been a long-time executive in the fossil fuel industry. So there's zero signs of change, politically speaking, here, but there is definitely, I would say, a growing public demand for action on climate change. But to be honest, I just cannot see anything changing under the current Morrison government. I mean, this is a Prime Minister who, before he became Prime Minister, once brought a lump of coal into Parliament and held it up to the guffaws of his colleagues saying, don't worry, there's nothing to be afraid of.
It's very Victorian, isn't it? You can imagine some Victorian industrialists doing that in sort of around 1850 when steam engines were the great new technology. You're like,
which is pretty much where this man's entire moral position and worldview comes from. It's kind of pre-1950s and pretty much back into the 18th century, especially his attitudes to women, but that's a whole other conversation.
Oh well, we'll have a good rant about that another time.
Exactly.
All men. Anyway, not that there aren't men who have very progressive attitudes to climate change, but it does tend to be that all the ones that don't are all men. So let's, before we have the full-on rant about Australia, because I'm sure...
But it's so much fun. I love learning about politics. Well, until my blood pressure goes down, I have a stroke, then it's not so much fun.
Let's get to some of the examples in your book about new technologies that are available that we are not using. Although before, the first thing I wanted to pick up on wasn't actually a new technology. It's a thing we don't talk about enough, which is energy demand. Because obviously, we have an amount of energy we use at the moment, and we can talk about how many wind turbines we would need to supply that amount of power. But if we keep increasing our demand faster than we can build wind turbines, then it doesn't actually do any good. What's the outlook for global energy demand?
Well, I guess it's increasing, obviously, but also we are hideously inefficient with the energy that we use. And one of the people that I interviewed for the book, she described it as, we've been at this all-you-can-eat buffet and we've been pigging out, and now the checks come. Or I don't know if that's probably bending the analogy a little bit too far. Energy efficiency is really, it's not sexy, but it's so important. And it's things like even just reducing transmission. So much energy is lost, electricity is lost over transmission lines. When we have, particularly in a country like Australia, where you can have electricity networks that stretch over thousands of kilometres, you're losing so much over that distance. It would make so much more sense for us to switch to these, as I mentioned earlier, these local, decentralised microgrids, which effectively can act almost as virtual power stations in themselves, where you have small grids that feed into the kind of a larger grid when there's demand, and these microgrids are also obviously supplied by their own solar panels, or it might, depending on where it is, it might be wave power, or it might be tidal power or wind power. So that's one way of improving energy. But even things like buildings, the amount of energy that's wasted in buildings, and green buildings is a really, really interesting area, because we don't realise how much energy is wasted by something as small as lack of insulation or gaps around windows, or the orientation of a building, the building materials, whether you have single glazed or double glazed windows. There's
also just all the embodied carbon of the building, right? Which, there's the sort of cement and the concrete and the stuff you use to make it, and the fact that that's there is, I think you're right. The buildings are one of the things that's difficult about buildings is we can you do you build new ones, or do you retrofit the ones you've got? And most of the houses we've already got, and retrofitting is really hard.
It is
to do it well.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's hard, but it's not insurmountable. It basically just requires working out what can we do, and sometimes that could be things like green roofs, which, funnily enough, I realised they're a lot harder to do in Australia, because we in the UK and EU and in the US, a lot of buildings are built for snow, so they're built to take weight of snow on the roofs, whereas in Australia that's not an issue. So buildings in the UK and EU are much more easy to adapt to have a green roof, and green roofs are great because it reduces captures rainfall for one thing, reduces.
So just describe what you mean by a green roof.
So
this
actually,
with
literally
grass growing on it.
Having plants growing on roofs. It's a way of increasing biodiversity. It helps cool a building, maintain kind of thermal mass. It's good for just kind of cleaning air in the particular area.
But I love the idea of having a roof that's kind of covered in daisies or something.
I know.
Perhaps the odd worm falling off the side on a bad day.
Exactly. But one thing I really love with energy efficiency as well is this idea that there are so many areas of waste energy that we can make use of in constructive fashion that don't involve redesigning an entire building. And so one of these, data parks, data farms, so server farms, generate huge amounts of heat, to the extent that a significant amount of the electricity consumed in these data server farm centre things, it goes into actually cooling them. And so, for example, in Stockholm, they have these data parks where they invite tech companies to set up their server farms. Stockholm basically collects the waste heat from these farms and puts it into the Stockholm's district heating network. So they actually turn that waste heat, so they buy it from these IT providers, and turn that waste heat into heating for Stockholm. And also because so much of Stockholm's energy is renewable, it means that these companies are being able to run their server farms on renewable energy. They don't have to use the extra energy to cool the server farm. So, it's a simple solution. And obviously they can do that because Stockholm has this district heating network. But even that's happening just in local areas, where you've got a basement full of hard drives, big servers, even just harvesting that waste heat and using it to heat a building. So much of energy efficiency is like, well, where are we wasting it? And how can we capture that waste and put it to use?
I went to a great place in Finland. So in Helsinki, they have a district heating system. They, pipes. But the thing they do is they harvest wastewater. So your hot shower water.
Yes.
And you can go down into these tunnels, and it's basically exactly the same thing. There's a low level of waste heat, like you get a 20 C difference, but you can concentrate. You can effectively shift that to make a smaller amount of it much hotter. Yes. And the whole of underneath Helsinki, there's just all these tunnels with everyone's waste shower water heating houses, actually, although it was mostly memorable because the Helsinki Energy Company is called Helen because it's Helsinki Energy, and and they had all of their sort of hard hats and coats they give you and all of that stuff all had Helen. And to my credit, I didn't accidentally walk off with any of them. But
missed opportunity.
I felt like this entire massive building with Helen on it. Yeah. However, their energy, and in Finland, it just, they're quite isolated. You think they probably had to be efficient. One of the things I think that's interesting about the waste thing is it's, so we were talking to a human physiologist on Monday for another Fully Charged thing. And almost the first thing he said is that humans have evolved to be spectacularly efficient, like our bodies. Because energy was so precious.
Yes.
So precious. And then suddenly we got technology and coal and, all of those years of evolution.
We worked out how to set things on fire, and then we just went, ooh, and then stood around. And that's pretty much all we've been doing for the last 3,000 years. We haven't really evolved much beyond that. But it's interesting, it's actually energy efficiency is called the first fuel because it is. We're already generating this energy, but we're not using it. We're actually generating more energy. We're actually consuming more energy to deal with the waste, which is just kind of stupid.
There's a lot of ranting in all of this, isn't it?
It's stupid. It's kind of hard not to rant when you get into climate stuff. I think it just, needless to say, my blood pressure goes up and down quite a lot when I do this sort of
well, you're probably generating some extra heat, so as long as you tap it off to do something useful, that's fine. Let's get on to the storage, because one of the stats that I'm going to find, that people listening to my microphone might hear me flicking through the pages here. The stats on storage, where is it? So you've got an estimate in here that I should have highlighted this a bit better. So that in 2017 there were 176.5 gigawatts of energy storage around the world, but the prediction is that we will need 266 gigawatts, and that's as a critical part of keeping global warming, under control. What's the deal with energy storage then, and are people taking it seriously? Because again, that's one of the things that's possibly not very sexy.
Yeah, look, they are. I mean, when we think of energy storage, the immediate thought is batteries. And certainly, lithium-ion batteries, which have succeeded largely by virtue of being first cab off the rank, so to speak, which may be an Australianism, I'm not sure. But first horse out of the gate, they dominate. So they account for about 90% of the global grid sort of stationary energy storage market. But this is an area, at least with batteries, that's, well, actually, I'd say energy storage generally, that is very much on the cusp of expanding rapidly because new technologies are being developed, particularly to avoid some of the issues associated with lithium and with cobalt as well. And it's really interesting to see what is evolving in this space. So, obviously batteries are really interesting. There's solid state batteries coming. We've got flow batteries, where you've actually got, which are very scalable because you basically just dealing with 2 tanks of liquid which you scale up. But what I found really fascinating was this idea of kinetic storage. And it's basically using gravity or the energy of motion to store electricity or to store energy. And so what you do is you use energy to lift things, in this case literally a huge big block of concrete, And then when you need to recover that energy, the block of concrete is allowed to fall in a controlled fashion, and obviously it's hanging from something. And as that fall happens, it turns a turbine, because it's unspooling.
So it's kind of like pumped hydro storage with solids.
It's exactly like pumped hydro.
Liquids.
I mean, pumped hydro is ancient. I mean, that's water wheels where we've been storing energy for a long time, and so pumped hydro is very, very efficient and it's very good, but it's limited by the fact that you need to have a water, kind of a particular type of water. You
need a big tank.
You need a big tank, or you need,
yeah.
a dam, the Hoover Dam, for example, or in Australia we've got the Snowy Hydro scheme. So that's sort of one option is all of these, and there's like these flywheel things which I didn't quite understand how they work, but kinetic storage is an area of a lot of interest. But the other thing as well is hydrogen.
So that's this Larvo. How do you say
Larvo,
this?
yeah, this is a hydrogen battery, and this is a really neat little system. It's Australian generated, Australian invention, and it's a hydrogen battery. But hydrogen is a really exciting, I think, for energy storage, because you can have an entirely closed loop system. So you use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, so it's a process called electrolysis, and then when you consume that hydrogen either in a fuel cell or it's burned, which is pretty rarely, usually in a fuel cell, the byproduct of that is water. So you can then recapture the water, and then you can generate more hydrogen from it all over again. So you can have an entirely closed loop system, which is very useful if you're in outback Australia, for example. So you use your solar to your excess solar energy or wind or tidal power to basically to generate hydrogen. So Larvo, which is this hydrogen battery, combines all of that into one unit, which is about the size of a standard refrigerator. So you have your solar panel, you use your excess electricity, you split water. So this is all happening in the battery, splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is then stored in a metal hydride that actually absorbs it, kind of like a sponge. And so you can store the hydrogen, and then when you need it, then it's combined with your, fed into a fuel cell, which then generates the electricity. And so it consumes water, but it's not a huge amount. I think it was like 4 litres a week or something. But it's a completely
even in Australia, system. In the desert,
you can manage 4 litres a week most of the time. So, hydrogen has the advantage, it's, once you compress it, it's transportable. You can also transport it in the form of ammonia, which is already transported around the world. So there's, certainly in Australia, there's a lot of interest in Australia, I guess, becoming a net energy exporter, using hydrogen as the potential medium to do that. And then obviously you can have hydrogen-powered cars and trucks and trains and buses and all sorts of exciting things. So hydrogen is very, very interesting.
So let's because I mean we're just jumping away in your book here, but that's, I mean, in a way that's kind of the point. I think it's quite nice to see all the things all at once, in a sense. So let's go on to materials production, because this is one of the other. So I was somewhere the other day, and there was someone who didn't have they were buying water, but they didn't buy it in a plastic bottle. I was like cringing. They bought it in a glass bottle, and they thought this was better. And I was like, glass is quite expensive. It can be recycled, but it's and then you do talk about this in the book, that glass and steel, the energy needed for them, the heat, is phenomenal. So what are people doing about them? What's the problem, first of all, and what are we doing about it?
Well, I guess the problem is what are called high heat industries. So these are industries where it's pretty much exactly as it sounds. They use not only do they use very large amounts of fossil fuels to generate very high temperatures, but often the chemical processes involved in these industries themselves generate carbon dioxide. So really we're talking about iron, steel and concrete, aluminium and glass. So those so iron, steel and concrete alone account for 9% of global energy consumption, and nearly half of the carbon emissions from industry.
Hang on that statistic, right? Yeah. 9% of global energy production is in aluminium, steel, what was the other one?
So iron, steel and concrete.
Iron, steel and concrete. Because that's a lot.
Right? That is. So steel and iron alone account for around 4 to 7% of total global carbon emissions. So that's just steel and iron.
These are big numbers.
It is some very big numbers. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you just got to look around wherever you are and you'll see that there is iron and steel and glass and aluminium and concrete everywhere. So these materials are ubiquitous in our lives, but they all require heat in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius in their manufacture. And that's general in the past has been very difficult to concentrate the sun to that sun's energy to that extent.
You're not going to do it with a magnifying glass.
No, you're not.
A small one.
No, absolutely. But that's not to say it's impossible. And certainly there are a number of innovations that are coming in this space. For example, using solar collectors, concentrating that energy and storing it. There's a company in the US called Heliogen, and what they do is they basically use mirrors, but they use these mirrors, these large fields of small mirrors, so they're much more tunable, and it's all controlled by this optimization engine that basically focuses the sun's energy on a very small area, about the size of a basketball hoop. And so within that tiny area, you get incredibly high temperatures. You can get those to up around 1,500 degrees Celsius. And so what you can then do is you can either store that heat, so for example in a molten salt solution, and then use it in your industrial processes, or you can actually, for example, through a conveyor belt, you can actually then pass the material that needs to be heated through that area to melt it or do whatever it needs to be done. So that's kind of one idea.
I love the idea of an adaptive mirror, this kind of like sci-fi, sort of shimmering surface that molds itself to shape the sun.
Absolutely.
I have to say, when I read about this, my first thought was, well, what do you put? So you point all these, this heat energy. It's what do you make that container out of? Because you clearly can't make it out of glass, steel, or concrete.
No, exactly.
Because they'll melt.
I guess there's a way of passing things through that.
There must be high temperature resistant. But I just like that idea of like, what's the container? Because it's got to get into the heat energy's got to get into the container.
Whatever they use in smelting to contain the. Whatever the same stuff that's smelt. Well, actually, I think it was. I did go and visit it was a bushfire testing facility here in Australia, and they actually test what happens when concrete melts, and it's a huge furnace. And I
don't think I even knew that concrete melted.
I didn't even know that concrete melted.
What happens when concrete melts?
You see the drip. It's. I think it's about 1,500 degrees Celsius. I can't remember exactly, but yeah. So the furnace itself is made out of things that don't melt at those temperatures. So that's probably a whole other area of chemical engineering. But I think what's really interesting as well with these high heat industries is how many of them are actually also looking now to hydrogen as a solution. So for example, ThyssenKrupp, I'm probably mispronounced that, but they're a manufacturer in Germany. They've developed a steel blast furnace that's fueled entirely by hydrogen. Similarly, so basically hydrogen can generate very, very high temperatures. So, and this is why, again, there's so much interest in hydrogen, is because of its potential for use in these high heat industries. There's also ways of generating steel without using coking coal, which is a massive source of carbon dioxide emissions. So
because again, that's the Victorian. It's almost before the Victorians, isn't it?
We've not advanced.
We learned about the Industrial Revolution, and you had to have these different grades of steel, and all the coal went into whatever it was. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we haven't learned. We've been using these technologies for so long. Why haven't we evolved? Why haven't we come up with better solutions? Because the pressure hasn't been there. Well, it's there now. So, and actually cement, sorry, I was banging on about this, but cement is a really interesting one, because cement, there's actually some really interesting innovations in the cement space where instead of cement generating huge amounts of carbon dioxide, which it does, you can actually have carbon positive cement. So carbon dioxide is actually used to cure the concrete, the cement and concrete. So, and you can actually store carbon in the concrete. So that's another really exciting area of innovation.
Well, the cement industry definitely has some catching up to do. I think they are heavy polluters. Well, next up on the list of things, there was this lovely sort of little fact or factoid in here about machine learning. Now, you described it as AI, but I've got to be in my bonnet. I think until it's Marvin the paranoid android, it's machine learning. Until you've got a generalized intelligence that is going to interpret my voice, it's all machine learning. It's just trained algorithms. However, you have this wonderful statistic, which is that in order to train, because this is what, the way machine learning works is you present a computer with an end goal, and then you let it try lots and lots and lots of things until it's learned how to get there. That's a simplification, but anyway. But you say there's this stat that training one natural language processing model, which is those things that sort of recognize our voice when they work, generates the equivalent carbon emissions of 125 return flights from New York to Beijing. So, which is, I mean, so that's just... Tell us a bit. That's a lot, and because we sort of assume computers don't do anything. I mean, they just sort of sit there, right?
Well, it's like Bitcoin. You know, Bitcoin is and I don't know the statistics, but Bitcoin mining, which, to be honest, I don't understand. But there is actually going to be a wide book about cryptocurrency, which I do intend to read. But Bitcoin mining generates huge amounts of carbon emissions, and so this is just purely from the grunt work of these server farms. That it's so data intensive, and server farms, you know, they've got these huge kind of rooms full of computers doing what computers do, whether that be a machine learning program, whether that be, you know, cryptocurrency transactions, whatever it is. I mean, you know, we are a data heavy society, and all of those server farms consume vast amounts of energy and generate vast amounts of heat.
This is just to do the computations. It's so computationally expensive that just to turn the computer handle, as it were,
that's
takes
all
that
it is.
much energy.
It's just the energy consumption. I mean, there might be energy consumption in terms of the actual embodied energy of the computers themselves, but just the computations. It's the computational energy of those machines.
And is anyone trying to do anything? I mean, we sort of hear that Google, various big companies, I can't remember which ones, are starting to say, oh, we're using renewable energy. I don't know if any of them are building their own solar and wind farms. I'm sure some of them are. Is there anything that, because I mean, computers, people have already tried. The one thing that people have tried to make efficient is computers, because the heat causes a problem, right?
Yes.
So people have already, I would be surprised if you go too much further. So is there anything that can be done about, you know, machine learning is going to be everywhere. Is that, do we just have to kind of suck that up and accept that if we want, you know, to be able to talk to our cars, then we have to manage this cost?
I mean, I think one of many encouraging things is how the tech sector has responded to the challenge of climate change. And, you know, pretty much you name any big tech company, Apple, Hewlett Packard, Microsoft, they're all have all made really significant commitments towards shifting their entire operations to renewable energy, looking at manufacturing materials that are zero or low carbon, you know, reclaimed materials. They're actually doing a heck of a lot to reduce the carbon footprint of their products and the use of their products. And also, I mean, it's not just the tech companies, these data center operators who you never really hear about. You know, these are the kind of the people behind the tech industry, but they're really interested in renewable energy because it's going to be cheaper for them. This is the thing, you know, you look in the Stockholm where, you know, the Stockholm data parks, they're trying to attract data center operators because they can offer them incredibly cheap renewable energy because Sweden has so much renewable energy in its network, and also they then buy their waste heat. So data center operators are really, really on top of this and are shifting very much across to renewables because that's, in a way, that's the easiest problem to solve. You know, it's not the problem that high heat industry have where you've got to reimagine your entire manufacturing process. You know, the data center operators, I mean, yes, you can look at, you know, literally designing your data center differently so that you can recoup the waste heat or so that you can improve airflow and reduce kind of hotspots. But ultimately, it's electricity, and that's a very easy problem to solve in a lot of ways. You just find a renewable energy supply and plug it into your network and you're away. So, you know, that, if anything, that sector I think is probably got it a little bit easier. That said, you know, it's a very energy hungry sector. So if there are ways to improve the efficiency of these server farms, to improve the efficiency with which our machines run, then that's also going to be a massive area of interest. And I think that there is also research going on, or at least work going on in that space to make machines run more efficiently and use less energy.
Well, that brings us on to something else which comes a bit later in the book, which is computers in general are making them sustainable. So, I mean, a lot of us, because basically you pick, you know, a modern mobile phone, it's basically metal and glass. it doesn't look very recyclable. And I'm one of those people that, held on to I very rarely replaced my phone right from the start. Whenever I did have to, I kept on, because I never threw one away, because I was like, so this has got valuable stuff in it, but I don't see anyone recycling it. So I held on to almost all of them until a couple of years ago, and I found someone who I thought might recycle them, and then I recycled a lot of stuff. Yeah. But you talk about computers, like the actual hardware itself being a really hard problem to make sustainable. And of course, it's all part of the problem with computers, it's got all these very clever things in it, but they're all very small and it's not like a big ball of aluminium. You put it in a recycling thing and then off you go. It's all mixed together. So talk to us a little bit about what's the hope for making computers more sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, it is a challenge because they are complex bits of machinery. So there's a number of considerations here. So one is the fact that, it used to be that the average lifespan of a mobile phone was 11 months.
That's horrifying.
It is horrifying. It's improved. I think it's up around 2 or 2.5 years. I can't remember what it was last time I looked. So it has improved. But it's this idea of planned obsolescence, that, these upgrades come out and it always feels like as soon as a new kind of version comes out, all the old versions suddenly start acting really slowly, or that I think that the tech companies are changing their approach to that. It's not that these new versions are coming out again really, really quickly, but also that what's kind of coming out now is this idea of right to repair, and this idea that if you buy a product, you should be able to expect that the company will be able to repair your product and give it a longer lifespan. So instead of, you take your phone to wherever to say, look, the battery's really crap, can I have a replaced battery? And they say, oh no, look, you just need to buy a new one. It's like, well, no, actually we will replace that battery for you, and or they can take it and recycle it themselves. There's also a push to design products to make them easier to recycle and reclaim the materials in them, because that's a really difficult thing to do, particularly with something like a phone. But this is happening in a whole range of, for example, printer cartridges used to be very complicated, and a lot of them still are, to recycle. There's all these different types of plastic and metal, and they're all intertwined and connected together. So there's been, and it was a while ago that I wrote about it, but this idea of we need to design printer cartridges so that when they finish their life, they can be taken apart, those different plastics can be reclaimed, and then can go back into generating more printer cartridges. So there's design aspect, designing these devices so that they are easy to reclaim the materials in them, and also making them easier to repair and cheaper to repair, and also I guess not rendering them obsolete with incredibly, with such rapid updates that if your phone is 5 years old, then it won't talk to somebody else's phone that's 2 years old. So there's a lot
like we're past that now, because there was 10 years when literally the difference was amazing, and it feels like now if you've got a tablet, that's pretty much what a tablet does. I can't imagine one doing
or having different plugs for each new thing. So you've got to buy a whole new one. It's like, get out! Like, can't I just use the same plug? So that those are all, and also some companies. So for example, I think it's Hewlett Packard is looking at using recycled aluminium in their computer bodies. There was another company, it might have been Hewlett Packard, that was looking at using, it's called ocean, I don't remember the term, ocean plastics.
Oh, it was on the river, something going towards the ocean.
So plastics that are recovered
on the way.
Plastics that are recovered within a certain distance of waterways and shorelines. Those plastics being collected and then actually being used as to create computers. So looking at using recycled and reclaimed materials, instead of digging, virgin materials out of the ground. So there's a lot happening, but yes, devices are particularly challenging because of, we use them all the time and they're everywhere. But really what we need to be doing is using them for longer and holding on to them for as long as possible. So.
I think I did cover, there was I don't know how far this had got, but there are bacteria that concentrate metals. That someone's found some bacteria in landfills, and they basically scoot around and they gather up all the gold or all the whatever the small metals are, and you can actually extract the bacteria, which I thought was, it is but like nature clearing up our mess, but in principle they're the right size to do the job. So that now I want to get to one more thing. Sorry, we're sort of rushing through, but there's so much in here, which is food, but specifically the labelling of food when it comes to carbon, because there's always like the problem with food in the modern society. I guess this was what was in the Omnivore's Dilemma, that book that was written. Can't remember the author, but anyway, somebody will tell me. But his point was that we've got too many decisions now, and so food is complicated because people are telling us to eat for our health, and they're telling us we should eat this and eat that, and that's all hard enough. And then you get onto the carbon cost, if you like, of food. And you say here that, the carbon food labelling is just hard. Why is it just hard?
It's hard because the question is, where do you stop counting the carbon? Do you, so say you buy a parsnip and it's been shipped from, I don't know, France. I don't know where they grow parsnips in Europe. Let's say Poland. It's been shipped from Poland. So you obviously...
I'm sure I should know, but I don't know.
I have no idea. I'm pretty sure you grow them in the UK.
North of England. I'm pretty sure we can grow them, yeah.
So obviously you then factor in those transport costs, the truck, the fuel. Do you factor in the cost, the embodied emissions, or a percentage of the embodied emissions associated with that truck? But then when you go onto the farm, how much of the farm's emissions do you attribute to that? Where do you look at the emissions of the fertilizer that was used to fertilize the field? Do you look at the emissions of the truck that was used, or the farming equipment? Do you look at the emissions of the embodied energy associated with the manufacture of that farming equipment? How far? It's a kind of, how long is a piece of string? And there's not an agreed sense of, well, you stop counting here. Or you accept that this is going to, if you stop here, you capture 90% of the emissions associated with a food product. There's no standard that exists for this. And so the problem with that is that people can say, oh, look, this is a really low carbon product, when all they've done is actually just calculated the amount of emissions associated with transporting that product from the farm to the supermarket. They haven't gone any back from the farm gate, for example. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that distant travel and transportation of food isn't just it. So, for example, if you in the UK are buying lamb from New Zealand, that's shipped all the way across from New Zealand, it still has lower carbon emissions per kilo than lamb that is farmed in the UK, or I think in the EU, because of the different farming techniques and because of the way that the emissions associated with where the lamb is and how it's farmed and all of those things. So distance itself isn't necessarily an indicator of carbon efficiency. So, we all got very, very obsessed with food miles, and quite rightly, because it is a bit bonkers that you should be getting, for example, in Australia,
it's
tomatoes.
It's the apples that get me, like the apples.
Yeah, apples and tomatoes.
We grow our own apples.
I know. And it's tricky in Australia because it's like, it's grown in Australia. Well, that's fine. It's possibly grown 4,000 kilometres away, So food miles aren't it necessarily. They are a component, but if you are starting to look at emissions in food, the number one thing is the content of your diet, and the number one thing baddie in that is red meat, unfortunately. So when we talk about lamb,
I'm not sad about that. I've been a vegetarian all my life.
Oh, well, there you go.
Exactly. Vegan now, so
yeah. Vegetarians and vegans.
It is, but I think it's a really interesting thing because it's interesting how. So I find it fascinating, just as a kind of anthropological thing, how attached people are to meat. Because when growing up, when I was just vegetarian, I felt so awkward, and it was just really, you would get this defense. You'd turn up and you'd say, if you're in a restaurant, you'd ask, do you have a vegetarian option? And whoever you're sitting with get really defensive. Oh, yes. I eat meat because of this and of this. Yes. I'm like, I've never asked you. I just want a carrot. Yes. And there was this immediate defensiveness, and now it turned like, it's really interesting to me that and I understand that this is not a problem I have and people are trying, but people are so attached to meat, and I stop eating things when I here I probably shouldn't, and I just stop, and I've never found there's nothing in my diet that I am so attached to in the way that people seem to be so attached to meat. And it's really interesting because people get really defensive about the meat. It's just like, I think it's a bit less of it.
I think for a long time it's been a symbol of wealth, and it is increasingly so in low and middle income countries. But, there's a narrative in Australia. It's just part of the narrative of being an Australian, chuck a steak on the barbie and have your sausages. And it's for a long time it's been sold as our cultural identity because, we made so much of our early money literally off the sheep's back. Environmentally speaking, Australia, it's been just absolutely devastating because this country was not made for cloven-hoofed beasties. The soils just are not. It
was made for the spiders.
It was made for the spiders and the kangaroos and all the little furry critters. It's cattle have wrought absolutely a huge amounts of environmental devastation, unfortunately. And that, that's changing. But it is a difficult one. I think changing diet, particularly diet, is people are very emotionally attached to their dietary choices. And I'm sure there are numerous anthropologists who could shed light on why it is that we are like that. I mean, we eat to live and we live to eat. But it is a very difficult one. And there's been a kind of very much a softly approach with this, like the idea of meat-free Mondays. And, even just one day, literally one day without meat makes so much difference to people's carbon emissions. It's really significant, and it's the one thing that's relatively easy, especially now, to cut or at least drastically reduce meat from your diet because vegetarianism and vegan diets are so ubiquitous. You can get so many more options. You can get substitutes. It's not like this is a difficult thing to do. I mean, I'm a red-blooded Hungarian Australian, and I married a vegetarian, and so it's there's no diffidifficulty here. I think it's an emotional attachment that I don't know somehow.
But it matters. We're human. It does matter. I'm not trying to do it down. I think you're absolutely right about identity. It's just that I find it quite interesting because I don't have that.
No, absolutely.
Although I might if you tried to make me me. I don't. I don't know. I'm on.
But I think it's interesting because it can have such a significant impact on individual household carbon emissions, and I think that's why it's such an important discussion to have. When people feel that despair about what can I do, I recycle. What else can I do? It's like, learn to cook something that doesn't have meat in it once or twice a week. It is that
just a bit less,
less, and it does make a difference. It's a small drop in the ocean compared to industrial emissions, compared to the kind of actions that governments can take. But at an individual level, if people want to know what to do, that's it. That's one of the really big ones.
Well, you've saved me asking that question. We are pretty much out of time, but I wanted to ask you about coffee cups and roads and pigs and biogas, but we haven't got time for that. Those articles you've written, people can look you up and look for those articles because they are quite interesting niche things to get into. But just so you've written all this, right? You've been thinking about this. You write about environment in general. You've clearly got a right bee in your bonnet about this, like a lot of fully charged listeners. You've already said that you're frustrated things aren't happening enough. But what is that, if Bianca ruled the world for a day, you get to make a law, right? Let's say you get to make one law on your day of being Queen of the World. What law would you make?
Oh, gosh. That's a horrible question.
Sorry. I'm not sorry.
I'm terrible at picking one thing. I always have to come up with a range of things. One of your laws. Okay, one of my many laws would be to end all subsidies for the fossil fuel industry globally, everywhere, tomorrow. End all government subsidies.
That's a
all
good
support.
law.
Cut them off at the knees, and let them fend for themselves in the open market, and they will fail because they are no longer cost competitive.
All right. Well, there we go. We've got Bianca's law. So thank you very much. So this book it's called Climate Change, How We Can Get to Carbon Zero. It's a wired guide. It is very, very bright green. So if you're looking for it, you definitely won't be able to spot it. I think it's out in the UK now. Is that right?
Yep, out in the UK, in print and electronically, I think everywhere. So yeah, check in your local bookshop.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, there we are. I hope you enjoyed that. It really is well worth reading the book, especially the later chapters, just because it's got such a super clear overview of the issues. It is very no nonsense, but it's really nice to have a robust overview of the whole thing. And there are a lot of statistics in there that we didn't talk about during the interview, but there's a lot of very useful numbers. So, and it is overall a very optimistic book. I was a bit worried that it might be, a bit grim, but no, there are lots of things that we can do, and there's all kinds of ideas in there for what's happening already, so well worth a read. If you've liked this and you'd like to support us, please subscribe to Fully Charged on Patreon, because, you know, money helps make things happen sometimes. And also subscribe to the Fully Charged podcast so that you don't miss any of our general ramblings on energy and the future of transport in the future. And also, obviously, the website fullycharged.show, which I still can't say without really concentrating, has loads of stuff, articles and blogs and videos and all kinds of things. So that's it for today. And if you have been, thank you for listening.